Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's show. This is There's a Will, and I am Will Richardson, welcoming you. Now, this week, there's been a lot happening, as you all know. It seems like chaos is taking over. So, to put some structure to the apparent chaos, we have three very good guests today. One of them is reporting to us from Poland, the other from somewhere on the road between Washington, D.C. and New York City, and the other from Ukraine at a location yet to be determined. So may I welcome Anthony McFarland Gonzalez, who is an ex-Special Forces medic and communications officer. He is a cyber security expert, and he is working soon to take up his post with the NATO Academy in Lisbon. Of course, Tony's a friend of the show. He's been on probably a record amount of times. He's been on almost as many times as I have. I think I've been on most of the shows, and from what I remember. And but you know, I got to stop drinking, you know, because sometimes I just forget. And
that's the fun of it.
Yeah, I know. And then we have I'll save the best for last. We have Patterson from somewhere on the road. You've stopped, and you're in your car. Where are you?
I'm at a Waffle House in Maryland.
Ah, it doesn't get better than that, except about everything else is better than that.
You know, I only see Waffle Houses when I'm back in Texas. And so I saw the Waffle House sign. I'm like, this is great.
Haven't you and I been to a Waffle House? I think we did.
We have.
One occasion, yeah. At least one. Yeah. Yeah, and our adventures in down south. And we have Clara Martin from Brazil, but also in Ukraine. Clara, where are you today?
Yeah.
Where are you today?
I'm in Nipro right now.
Okay.
Eastern part of Ukraine.
Yeah, you're back in Dnipro because you were in Kiev earlier when I spoke to you, right?
Yes, a few days ago.
Yeah, but you're back in Dnipro where you live. Clara, let's start with you. You're from Brazil. You're from, am I right in thinking Sao Paulo? Do I remember correctly?
Yes, that's correct. I'm from Sao Paulo originally.
Okay. And we met at the World for Ukraine conference. And in the seminars there, and you were also working with a group that was providing replacement windows, which was a very interesting project. A lot of people found interesting at the conference. But what intrigued me about you was that you're from Brazil, from a massive city. I mean, you know, your city is almost the size population of Ukraine, if you count all of it, you know. If you combine it with Rio, it's bigger. The two cities are bigger. And you found yourself in a small town called Dnipro, where you've been living in Brazil. Dnipro, as some people will know, is right on the river and close to front lines, or it was right on the front line for much of the war. Is that still the same situation? What's it like in Dnipro now?
Dnipro was a city that was never under occupation with Russian troops. However, we are constantly attacked with missiles, drones, and other rockets. But not really. We don't have artillery here. We don't have troops. We're about 200 kilometers, depending on the direction from front lines, but still get hot from time to time. Yeah,
so you're removed from the front line, but you still feel the heat. That's the point. Clara, what's it like now? We're a year and coming up for 2 years and 3 months of the war, 4 months. What's the mood these days?
So the war is obviously focused mainly on the east, right? And we don't really have, other than air attacks, Russian presence in other parts of Ukraine. So it's a very concentrated area with armed conflict. However, the situation in the front is just the morale is very low with the advancements that are being made by Ukraine and also the lack of interest that almost 2 years of war brings to the country, right? People just move on and the troops can feel it.
Yeah, this is not a good situation. We could call it war fatigue, perhaps, but that's been a phenomenon from as early as June, 3 months into the war of 22. Started noticing that this was a problem. Do you think the apparent stalemate, I say apparent because there are movements being made by increments still in the South, according to reports, do you think that the lack of progress combined with the amount of wounded, casualties, wounded and killed, is what's causing this as well? Just the sheer weight of that?
It's a combination, right, of several factors. The boys and the girls that are in the front lines, they stay for months at a time without breaks, without seeing their family. The situation in the trenches is usually horrible. They spend a lot of their own money to buy supplies, to buy food, to buy armor, helmet, IFAX. Then you have the normalcy in the rest of the country, right? And then a lack also of international attention. And a lot of people just feel abandoned in the front lines.
Okay, let's start with that, the feeling of being abandoned, because then I want to talk to Patrick Patterson, who is a conflict photographer who spent over a year in Ukraine, about 15, 16 months, I think, if I remember correctly, since the war began, and he's been doing some lectures in the United States in the Northeast and in Washington. And recently, Patrick, why don't you tell us about what the sense of abandonment is amongst Ukrainians in the United States, and what you've been working on, and why, and where you've been the last 2 or 3 days in Washington.
Certainly. So I just left Washington. Spent yesterday on Capitol Hill with a series of my photographs, specifically from Museum, highlighting an individual named Misha, who lost his family in an aerial bomb attack in March. And spoke with different Democratic senators, one Democratic congresswoman, as well as the Ukrainian ambassador. And aside from the conversations that I have at lectures and my day in DC yesterday, the topic of Ukraine is almost non-existent here in the United States. You can find it on the bottom feed of a major news outlet page, but certainly Israel and Gaza has overshadowed what's happening daily in Ukraine. And as far as the stalemate, we spoke about that yesterday with the ambassador, and it was in a reference to the Ukrainian general's comment about with his interview in The Economist. And so she said that they're absolutely not at a stalemate, and without Western support and help, it's just going to take an extraordinarily long time to move and advance forward. She said that the amount of mines that are laid, you could take them from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. So without new technology, it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to move forward with any speed. So unfortunately, the sentiment in the United States right now is the support for Ukraine is falling by the wayside. And Senator Shaheen yesterday said something that I think is important. If we stop funding Ukraine, what does that say to our allies, as well as to our adversaries, right? So we made a commitment to support Ukraine, and if we pull out from that support, from that perspective alone, I think it says a lot.
Tony, let's come to you. We're talking about this theme of abandonment, which we heard from Clara, who's right there close to where the hot spots are, down in Dnipro. And then we're hearing from Patrick that this is a bottom of the first page or interior of the newspaper issue now, after being the headline for so long. Tony, why is that? And why is the tale? I mean, we know that the Israel situation is, of course, of utmost seriousness. All of these situations are serious. We're looking at a possible conflagration in the world set off by these conflicts. Perhaps the most serious time is getting more serious. I mean, people said Ukraine was the most serious time since the invasion of Ukraine was the most serious thing since 1962, missile crisis, and Cuba. And now we've got another front opened and intimations of another front yet again out in the South China Sea with Taiwan. So can you tell us how it happens that such a major event like Ukraine doesn't even rate a place on people's screens because of the month-old conflict in Israel? I mean, in World War II, you had news from both fronts on the front page. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's propaganda on both fronts. But this one is different because it's, well, not exactly different, but it's political agendas. And that's the unfortunate part that we're facing, is that because the partnership and the agreement and the strategic location of Israel, the U.S. has basically converted all their attention to help that ally, which doesn't make any sense as to why they're leaving and abandoning in what people are making it view like, or they feel like they're abandoning Ukraine, which is also a strategic ally. The problem that the U.S. has right now is the administration that they have. I'm not going to go into the politics of that one, but the administration is solely focused on the Middle East. And it's because the Middle East interests that they have, interests such as oil, partnerships, military deals, as in armament deals with key individual countries, Saudi Arabia, of course, Israel, Bahrain. Then they also have partners with the UAE, and so on and so forth with those partners that they have. But the biggest partner that they're forgetting is that Ukraine. Yes, they still have pushed through Congress that there's a $60 billion deal on top of their 40 million or 20 million they're going to be pushing out to Israel and a couple other partners in the region. But they bundle that up together. But that still doesn't mean the fact that they feel like a sense of abandonment, because it's media also. So there's two sides to the house. There's media, and then there's the political side. And they're playing a dangerous game. They're playing an extremely dangerous game right now, because the intelligence that has faltered on Israel's side is their Israeli fault. Now, Ukraine still has a war. People are losing interest. The reason they're losing interest is because the media. I can't stress that even enough. The media is the biggest problem that we've had. Yes, granted, from the military side, that's a problem, but from the civilian side, that's something that they need to know. But media has lost the valor of reporting good information and feeding it where they need to, because it's only for doom and gloom, and that's it.
I'd say you have to switch to the British media. You have to switch to podcasts, of which there are many, many good ones, solid ones, with people, experts, people, generals and reporters and people who know what's going on. People like Patrick who've been there. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like Patrick, like myself, like Clara, like you. But we also have to be very careful on the people that we speak to, because some of these individuals are being paid under the pocketbooks or have an extremely different view that actually is chastising a country that has been invaded.
Well, that's in both cases. That's the case with Israel and with Ukraine. They've both been invaded, people murdered wholesale, and yet people are marching, or certainly in the case of Israel, that's just anti-Semitism at its heart.
But you could say that's also anti-Semitic to Ukrainians, because originally they wanted to destroy this entirety of the nation and put it underneath Russia again and stealing the resources. So that's almost anti-Semitic. However, Ukraine is not Israel, and Israel has had much deeper issues with these knuckleheaded Palestinians for thousands of years. I can't really say that because Ukraine's also had issues with Russia for thousands of years. But that's...
Yes, but people are even protesting the Philistines being done down in the Bible by King David. I read that.
Yeah, I know. I saw that. I was like,
the height of absurdity. How can people be so absurd when so many lives are at stake? Is the problem that to make a political such a volatile political issue out of an already life and death situation in both countries is beyond me.
See, but the thing is, you got to understand that this ties into a lot of other issues, that people are not seeing. They're really not putting those pieces together.
Okay, let's table that and come back to that in the second part, because I want to get back. Okay. If you'll bookmark that, as we say, and do that, and we'll come back to it, because I want to go back to Patrick, because I don't know if we'll have him for the second half. I'd say, okay, you've heard what Clara had to say about abandonment. You've heard what the analysis is from our NATO spokesperson, or not spokesperson, but our NATO academic and cybersecurity expert. Now, what did you say to people in Washington, to the politicians? Did they listen? What were their comments? Patrick.
There's nothing, it's hard when you're in a vacuum, because everyone is rallying with each other, and there's no argument. So I simply wanted to share a story that they could use to humanize and put a name with a face, and try to share his story, this particular one story, with those who aren't wanting to support Ukraine. Empathy right now is what we're missing, and understanding that these are human beings. Certainly everyone that was there yesterday was incredibly responsive. Senator Shaheen.
She's senator from New Hampshire, is that correct?
She is, yep.
Okay, yeah.
She genuinely is fighting for funding for Ukraine, and it's sincere. The media has failed in so many ways with this war, far before Gaza and Israel. And what I have to say about this is that until the narrative shifts from the business of war and starts humanizing what war does to civilians in the mainstream media, we're not going to have the support that we need in any war. Soon, Gaza and Israel will fade away, and it will become just like Ukraine at the bottom of the news page, and something else will take it over. We see that repeatedly for the last, as long as I've been alive, right? Looking at news, it's just what happens. People stand in the streets in protest, and they say that they're going to stay there forever in protest, but they go home. Something's changed in at least Americans, that they either give up or they just don't care. They're so self-focused on themselves and what's happening in their own small bubble, that Ukraine and quite honestly, Israel and Gaza probably doesn't even come up in most conversations and here in the United States within the average populace. So I blame the media on this. And I will say this for Gaza and Israel. I started to go to Ukraine, and when I would see civilian infrastructures bombed and see children coming from mass graves, it's the civilians that take this brunt. And we also have to have empathy for the civilians and kids in Gaza as well as Israel. Why can't it be a both and? It doesn't just have to be one.
Do you think people don't have sympathy for the people in Gaza? They don't have sympathy for the people in Ukraine? I mean, you said that people feel distracted. Yeah, okay.
I absolutely think that people in the United States are split, and they feel like they can't be supportive of the innocent people dying in Gaza and be supportive of the innocent people dying in Israel. It's completely divided.
I think the distinction has to be made between the ordinary people and the Hamas guerrillas.
Absolutely. So when I talk about the people who are dying in Gaza,
but people don't make that distinction. That's what you're saying. Yeah.
So I was in Cambridge last week, and there was a pro-Palestinian.
You mean at Harvard? Yeah.
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 There was a pro-Palestinian march going down the street, and on the other side of the street, just random people walking down, yelling, explicit language across the street at the Palestinians, and essentially telling them to F off. And it's like, what do you do if you're Palestinian? What if you do what if you are this innocent human being that is not a part of Hamas, and you want to fight for your country, fight corruption, fight against terrorism?
Yeah.
And then you're looked at as this evil human being because you have a Palestinian flag. But that doesn't make you a bad person.
It's just you're absolutely right. And the problem is context. And the problem also is that whether out of desperation.
Anthony,
sorry, go ahead.
No, but Anthony, so this is my point. We absolutely, and Israel absolutely needs to respond to Hamas's attack. But there's more than one way to respond to that with military force. And I understand that by doing what they're doing limits the casualties of Israeli forces before they go in. But when you join the military, you take a responsibility knowing that you may lose your life. When you go into a war zone, you absolutely know that you may lose your life. It doesn't validate leveling complete areas of a city with large munitions, killing innocent people. If we saw the same thing as what's happening in Gaza and Ukraine, it should be the same response. When we see civilian buildings hit in Izum that had Ukrainian forces nearby, but yet we all mourn and say what an awful attack that was from Russian forces to kill 54 civilian Ukrainians in their basement because there was a cluster of Ukrainian forces on the street. We didn't say, well, that's just the cost of doing war. So why can't we have the same conversation when we see a hospital bombed in Gaza, killing innocent children and women who have nothing to do with Hamas, but our response is, oh, well.
Well, which hospital are you talking about?
The one that had the one that's really the only working one in Gaza was one of the southern hospitals. Patrick, I agree. I absolutely agree with your sentiment, with what you're saying, and the sentiment is there. However, here's the problem from the military side of the view. Hamas, being the dirty little devils they are using civilian infrastructure and buildings, and they're hiding in the basements. Their tunnels and infrastructure are connected so deep in Gaza, throughout the entirety of Gaza Strip and city, that it's a virtually impossible war to win and defeat all those tunnels and to get into there without the proper munitions. And those munitions are going to cost thousands of civilians' lives because they're still listening to the Palestinian governments to tell them to stay there because Hamas controls Palestine. And that is, the majority of it is 70% controlled by Hamas. That's the problem.
The other
and
problem,
people stayed.
Yeah. The other problem, we've got to end this segment, but the other problem, if I may add, is that the Palestinians, whether out of desperation or not, voted in Hamas. At least they appeared to. If those were at all free elections.
But Will, he is right, though, that we do have to look at it as the same if we're looking at the humanitarian effects that are happening in Israel as it did happen in Ukraine.
The problem is that I think you could compare the response, I'll say this really quickly, let people think about it. You could compare the response to 9/11 and the response, which was a very protracted response by the U.S. military, because I was there, I know, within, 6 weeks after the bombing in 9/11. And the rather immediate attack from Israel. Of course, Israel's in a different position than the United States, but that's worth thinking about too. Context is really the most important part in looking at both of these theaters of war at the moment, and we better get our context right, and we better start thinking about saving lives rather than taking them. Okay, see you after the break. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Patrick Patterson has continued his drive northward and will not be in the second half, but we still have with us Clara Martin from Dnipro in Ukraine, and we have Anthony McFarland Gonzalez from Bydgoszcz, yes, I believe. Must be Bydgoszcz because I saw the dog photograph or whatever it is behind you.
Portrait.
The print. Yeah, is that a portrait? This is a print, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a print.
Yeah. I wanted to come back and start this segment by getting Clara to tell a little bit more about her very interesting life and why she is, how she ended up in Ukraine, in Dnipro particularly, in Ukraine, in Dnipro, at the beginning of the war. So Clara, you could take us forward.
Right, thank you, Will.
Thank you.
So when the full-scale invasion started last year, I was actually living in Germany, working on my MBA, and then I just offered my apartment to the Brazilians who were leaving Ukraine and entering Europe if they needed a place to stay. This offer then was followed by other Brazilians and the Brazilian community in general in Europe offering their apartments as well. And we started a group of Brazilians trying to help trying to assist the Brazilians that were trying to leave Ukraine. And on the same day, February 24th, we got the first evacuation request from a family of 5 people who were in Kharkiv. Was already being invaded or attempted to be invaded by the Russians. And we started to work to get these people out and help them find the trains or the way to get out of Ukraine. On the 25th, I actually drove myself from Germany to the border in Poland, and the 27th was the first day that I crossed into Ukraine. It was the first evacuation that my team made. I left 36 hours later through Hungary with 3 Brazilians and 1 Nigerian and 1 Ukrainian girl. And after this, I just kept on coming back because I saw the situation inside the borders. People were standing for days. It was extremely cold. Water was low, food was low. And we just kept on coming back and doing this back and forth of coming in with aid and living with people. Slowly through the months, I started pushing east until where I am today, based in Nipro, but we work mainly close to farmlands. And that's the story of how I ended up here.
Right, and you're working with a Brazilian NGO, or you founded one, as well as being a co-founder of the Windows. Tell us about both of those, if you could briefly.
Yeah, of course. So Insulate Ukraine, I joined in February this year, and then I became a co-founder a month later when we decided to incorporate it in Ukraine. We create temporary windows. We have installed over 10,000 windows since February in cities Liman, Nikopol, Izum, and Kherson, right?
That's extraordinary. Tell us about these windows. How do they work?
Right, so they're just very easy and affordable windows, very efficient. They're made of simple materials, just PVC pipes, insulation foam, and polyethylene and tape. It costs about $15 to make and install a window. Through this project, we generate a lot of income, right, and jobs for Ukrainians here on the ground. We have about 40 people working in these 4 cities today. So it's very important for us because not only we're able to provide the same insulation as a double glaze glass at a fraction of the cost, but also help these people to have jobs and to promote the local economy. The other one, the Brazilian-Ukrainian organization, we started when we decided also to formalize the work that the Brazilians were doing here since February 2022, and we incorporated this in Ukraine. What we do is mainly delivery of supplies to frontline villages, that food, hygiene items, to both civilians and military. And we've been working at it for almost 2 years now. And it's growing the attention that we get, right? For being Brazilians, there aren't really many of us around here. And we're shifting to work with mental health and rehabilitation.
Okay, very good. Recently, like Patrick, you've been in the Capitol, only he was in Washington, you were in Kiev. Who were you talking to there? And what was the purpose of your trip?
Right, so last month I was invited by a parliamentary group, Brazil-Ukraine, from the Brazilian Senate, to speak at a public hearing about my work here in Ukraine. And following this public hearing, I was invited to a meeting with some members of the Ukrainian parliament to also discuss getting this approximation between Brazil and Ukraine on a governmental level, and to also understand how we can help Ukraine to, well, actually any way we can in the projects that they have ongoing at the moment.
What kind of interest is there in Brazil, would you say, in supporting Ukraine? Is it just a few people, or is it big news in Brazil, or what's the story there?
So as with everywhere in the world, it used to be very big news, and now we have headlines from time to time when something very specific happens in Ukraine. But what we see is that the Brazilians, the Brazilian civil society, they're very inclined and sensibilized by the situation in Ukraine, which is a very different stance from my federal government, of course. And we believe, at least, that now we're able to push the Brazilian government in helping with humanitarian aid, because we know where they stand with military, right? But if we can push the Brazilians to help us with humanitarian aid, that's a big step for us, if it comes with support from our federal government.
Who's
the Brazilians are
Yeah.
actively helping us.
They are.
With
And
donations. Yes.
I mean, is there a groundswell? Because Brazil is in the so-called BRICS group. How serious is that, and how does that prevent or divide loyalties with regard to the invasion of Ukraine and aid to Ukraine?
Well, we clearly see, and this is from a little bit of personal perspective as well, but we know where this government and the previous also lies, right? The loyalty, which is more inclined towards Russia. And, you know, in a situation that's very black and white, like Ukraine, where you have an invasion, right? Ukraine is not trying to conquer Russia. Ukraine is not trying to take territory from Russia. Ukraine is just defending itself. If you choose to be neutral about it, you already chose a side. And unfortunately, the remarks from my president have been very ignorant, I would say, since before he was the president, and also following our last president. The BRICS, I believe, they play a huge role in the position of my government to not support Ukraine in other areas, or to be so slow even in the humanitarian supplies, right? We have.
So there is an effect. There is an anti-Ukraine effect.
There is a huge effect. We are receiving a huge migration of Russians moving to Brazil. Inflow of money. Obviously, we have economic ties to Russia. Then we have the economic ties with BRICS. It's a delicate situation, obviously, for the Brazilians when it comes to an economic perspective, to decide how they're going to behave when it comes to Ukraine.
Yeah, you know, just by way of talking a little anecdote, a short one about Brazil. You know, I did some work down in Belém at one point. I was there, you know, back and forth, and I just was reading some things about by and about Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, of course. His first wife was an epidemiologist from Belém. How about that? Way back in the 30s or 20s, 100 years ago.
It's a very interesting.
I thought that was an interesting. I had no idea. So, but anyway, very interesting stuff. Very interesting stuff. So it must be difficult in some. There must be a push me, pull you with regard to your government's position and your own involvement, I suppose.
Well, my personal involvement is to help Ukrainians, right? That's why I'm here. What my government stands for I can't do much about it. All we want is to keep on supporting the people that are suffering every day from this incredibly stupid situation.
Thank you. Tony, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah. If I could just see you, would be helpful. I can't see you. Anyway, let me ask you, what do you think about what Clara was just saying with regard to BRICS? I didn't realize we were going to go into that subject, but that question raised itself. What do you think about that?
Yeah, BRICS, unfortunately, Brazil, the government, we can't really fix. The civilians have shown who they really are. They've shown their true colors. They've shown that they are human, that they're not monsters, that they are people, that we are helping each other out. And that's Brazil. That's exactly what we know. That's the Brazil that we know. That's the Brazil that we love. And that's the one that we fell in love with decades ago.
Right.
For what the government has changed in their way to align themselves with governments that are pushing evil agendas across the world, that's something we can't fix, man. As Clara pointed out, everybody is not Brazil. Brazil is the people, the gente, la unidad. It's not the government. And that's the one thing that we have to understand in this world is that the people are the government, not the government is the government. No. The people make the government. So as long as the people are continuing to push to do the right thing, there is hope in this world. So that's
well, as long as there's
good.
some kind of republic or democracy involved, And we exactly. see that whenever there's elections, we can still see it.
But to put to the point that she touched a really interesting point that they will continue to support Russia in their failed attempt. It's failed attempt to literally invade Ukraine, to overthrow Ukraine. But Brazil unfortunately has, the government of Brazil has pushed munitions and weapons just like South Africa has over there to support. And then the one thing that is really kind of it's a double-edged sword for Brazil. It's good that they have Russians moving in there to bring and help grow in the economy because Brazil's economy was suffering a little bit. However, the problem is that these are some of these could probably be oligarchs moving over there too, and that's going to impede.
For sure, some place to park their yachts where they don't get
But
confiscated.
these are the nuances, right, of geopolitics as well.
Exactly.
We know where Brazil stands as a government because of the economical position, right? It's very hard. I can sort of understand it.
Sorry, can we get her on screen, please? Can we get Clara on screen?
I think the biggest disappointments that we have as Brazilians is the delay or the lack of humanitarian efforts, right?
Thank you.
Which Brazilians can understand more. The refusal to send military equipment. And as a Brazilian, I don't know how much we would benefit from our expertise in military. But the delay or this lack of humanitarian support is really the biggest issue for us and for me personally, right? It's people suffering. And Brazil, in my perspective, when we started talking about peace negotiations, we are still one of the biggest countries and one of the biggest economies in the world. And actually, this proximity with Russia could be quite beneficial for us to talk about some peace options or some ceasefire or some humanitarian corridor or some access to occupied territories to provide medical and medical treatment and supplies to the people in occupied territories. And I believe my country is one of the only ones in the world who probably has the pull with Russia and with Ukraine to try to establish that, right? I don't, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Russia would shoot a Brazilian convoy. I think they would shoot a UN convoy because we've seen it happen. But I don't think the same would happen for a Brazilian government-led initiative to provide help to the people. And this is the disappointing, I would say, end that we see from my government. But we see now, at least in comparison to the previous government, we see a door of opportunity in having supplies sent by my government to Ukraine. So that's, it's a little bit, but it's a step forward.
Well, you're a very good spokesman for that, Clara. I'm glad we were able to get you on the program finally. Can I come back to the NATO posture on all of this? You're going to assume a job training in the academy in Lisbon, the NATO academy, soon, the end of the month. And what is the posture of NATO, and how do we explain this unfathomable to me idea that the situation in Ukraine and Israel are not the most important subjects for the news to be covering?
Actually, it's a lot more than just the news. It's one of the most important events, some of the most important events in human history,
yes.
Recorded history. Reason is because, I'll get to the history about it in a minute, but NATO's posture is because they see and feel that a certain ally to the West is not probably going to save them. And Poland has been leading that issue where they're bolstering their military. Finland has been that same way already. Sweden has been telling NATO, hey, step up your game because Russia is going to be playing a dirty, dirty, dirty game. Norway has been sounding those warnings, especially with the northern access to the North Sea, and there's stream of activity not only from Russia but from also Chinese vessels. Yes, they don't talk about the Chinese vessels that are up there. NATO has been combating that.
Chinese vessels in the North Sea and the Baltic?
Not the Baltic, but North Sea.
North Sea.
Okay. I'm not sure about the Baltic, but the North Sea for sure.
Yeah, okay.
And that's because of the Arctic waters melting. And that's true. And that's been proven. And they've actually said that they have extremely vested interest with their partners from.
Well, this is the old climate change thing and the takeover of the polar areas by the Russians. Yeah.
Yes, and that's bringing in much more of the war. So that's why they're saying this is why they're posturing heavy, bringing in more individuals because countries in the past 20 to 25 years have reduced the amount of forces because they didn't think that the bear in the east is going to be an extreme aggressor. Even though there have been warnings from agencies telling the countries' governments that, hey, don't be silly, this country is really still an extremely aggressive country. Don't be fooled. They didn't heed the warnings. Now they have it. So they're not taking any second chances anymore. They're going to be bolstering all over to every single post to include to keep training personnel to be ready and active if the time comes. And that's what I would suggest for a lot of the other countries that are there. I mean, they're probably doing it. But the thing is, we've shut down a lot of the smelting factories, shipbuilding, manufacturing of military equipment, hardware, so on and so forth, and the industries that supported the military, such as cyber, my realm. We pushed back a little bit as we didn't invest in the government, but now they're really they're reaping what they sow. So to answer the long story short, yeah, NATO's bolstering is because of Ukraine, unfortunately. And now that they see that there's another second theater that is a possibility that could be, the third theater, they're not taking any chances.
Okay, which is why we see the attack groups being sent out.
The attack groups are in response to.
You're talking about the naval attack groups. Yeah.
Yeah, the attack groups from the U.S. and that's okay. There was an attack group that went to the Baltic. That was one of the new Ford-class carrier groups. That was the attack group. I don't remember the naval attack classification for that group. But then they were reassigned to aid Israel, along with another attack group that came in through the Mediterranean at the same time. And there's an amphibious attack group that is in the Red Sea. And there is part of that amphibious attack group that went towards the through the Suez Canal area. I forget that area it is, but they intercepted 3 missiles that were inbound to Israel
Right.
from Yemen. And that's one of the reasons why they're there. They're there to prevent and also stop attacks on themselves. So they're aiding an ally. So they're holding a promise that they are keeping. So that's why those attack groups have moved in there, and also to try and keep regional stability.
What's the position? What's the position of Turkey in NATO?
They are. Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I know that Turkey's position with Israel is null and void. They do not support Israel. Period. As far as the position in NATO, your guess is as good as mine right now. I haven't really followed up on the NATO one.
Yeah, because it seems crucial at this point. It's very hard to figure out what is going on with Turkey because, in one sense, on the northern flank, they need to be in control of the Black Sea because that's traditional sticking point between the Turkish and the Russians, going back, 200 years or more. And then you have the religious component being part of, though not Arab, and actually not really liking the Arab countries traditionally, but being the biggest and most powerful military of the Islamic countries. Mm-hmm. They have this natural disinclination to back Israel. So,
well, the not to back Israel, to upend Israel. They have an inclination naturally to back Palestine.
Yeah.
They actually, Erdogan did come out and make a comment that he said that he does condemn Israel's actions and does stand behind Palestine's movement.
Yeah,
and
that's why I asked you the question about NATO. Boy, that's a split personality there suddenly. One is religious, one is strategic. And this is the interesting point. You could do a really good book on the bifurcation of personality of Turkey, this division between the religious impulse and the strategic impulse, and how that affects them as a ally and as a force of their own, because they have long time ties, for example, in the tech field with Japan.
Yeah, and
in aerospace, they're a big ally of Japan.
Yep, and they're the ones that are helping them build the 5th generation next air dominance fighter for Turkey. And the other thing is too that the NATO bases that are there, specifically Izmir, that's one of the most critical ones for Turkey, and that's most critical for the Allies to have access to the Black Sea because it's right there. And it also has Mediterranean access, which also gives them quick access response. So it's like a QRF to any of the actions that are happening down in the Middle East because it can be there within an hour, hour and a half.
What is Poland's position in all this? I think we're running down to time. What is Poland's position in this and vis-a-vis Ukraine and within NATO at this moment? How vital is Poland?
For Ukraine, extremely vital.
And for NATO?
It's honestly becoming the biggest and strongest military that NATO has, besides the United States.
What does this mean, in the last couple of minutes, what does this mean for the future of the border of the EU, the NATO border, with Russia and Ukraine going forward?
NATO is strategically placing units on the eastern flank to protect its allies. At least I hope they continue to honor that oath with all the countries that are part of NATO. But Poland is probably going to be standing alone if NATO falls apart. I hope it doesn't. But the NATO...
That's exactly what the Russians want. It's what they've wanted from the beginning. It's what they've wanted since the collapse of communism.
But what they're trying to do, they're trying to take the biggest NATO partner in the biggest NATO ally there, the U.S., and distract them and pull them in 3 different directions. And that's what they're trying to do. And they're probably going to do it in a systematic step. Who knows when the kickoff is going to happen in the Pacific, but we know it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when.
So Turkey basically has been flanked with conflict, serious conflict. That's your point, isn't it? Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's the same. I'm comparing it to the United States because Turkey is pulled in 2 different directions. Mm-hmm. NATO and Islam. But then you have its ties and relationships with Russia.
Of course. Okay, let's go give Clara the last word from Dnipro. Clara, how do you think things look in 60 seconds? How do you think things look for the winter in Ukraine with regard to the conflict, the war?
I think it's still hard to say what is going to happen during the winter, if we're going to make more advancements, if the Russians are going to start moving through the dry areas of the river down in Kherson, which we already have some crossings after the explosion of the dam. Now we don't have the water anymore, and they're crossing on foot, and artillery is getting very heavy on that area. We have the new Bakhmut situation in Avdiivka, so it's very difficult to know. I know that my guys in this obviously are struggling with winter uniforms, boots, and the life on the trenches just gets much harder for the military, and at the same time just gets very, very hard for the civilians because of lack of energy, lack of fuel in distant villages. So it's just going to be tough all around.
I don't understand why they're lacking in these basic supplies, because you could easily gather this from surplus material lying around in Western Europe and Central Europe and the United States and Canada, etc. There's plenty of stuff there. There's no reason for these people to be going without, except for the will to get it to them. Yeah.
To be fair on this point, I'll say from my experience, it's a lot of lack of communication between not only the grassroots organizations here that are working as humanitarians, but also the major players. They just don't communicate with each other, and then they end up sending aid where it's not necessary, overlapping the aids that are being sent to people. It's just, unfortunately, a lack of coordination.
I mentioned Mr. Huxley, Clara. I mentioned Mr. Huxley before, Aldous Huxley. And in his book, Enemies of Freedom, he said that he predicted that one of the biggest problems would be this continued specialization and lack of communication between different entities, powerful entities, would lead to chaos if it wasn't, if those communication lines were not. This is in the 1950s, he was saying this, and it hasn't changed at all, despite how smart we ought to be, how smart we think we are, and we ought to be.
Yes, it's, we have a lack of the big players in the front line, so we don't really see them at all, anywhere. You only see the UN cars sparkly clean, which I think my car cannot stay clean one day if I wash it. So I don't know what the budget for the UN is of car wash, honestly. But they don't do front lines, right? So this is all third parties that are the ones actually going there. And because they don't communicate, then you send resources that people don't need to a place, and then people who need it don't have access to it. Then you send stuff that the Ukrainians can actually have access to, and you crash the local economy. So this is a big problem on the humanitarian sector.
Thank you, Clara Martin from Dnipro in Ukraine. Thank you very much, Clara. Appreciate it. Your very interesting commentary and fresh commentary. Also, Anthony, as usual, your expertise is greatly appreciated here, my friend. We thank you. And thank you for watching. I'm Will Richardson. This has been There's a Will.
Borrow